opportunity to wrap up this year because we are happy to have our very own STAND events coordinator presenting today. So Nicolas Rasiulis is a personal friend and PhD candidate here at McGill, and he is Canadian-Lithuanian anthropologist. As both an undergraduate at the University of Ottawa and a canoe expedition guide, Nicolas researched transformative effects of open-air nomadism on relations with oneself, others, and nature. During his master's at the University of Ottawa, Nicolas researched ways in which Mongolian Dukha reindeer pastoralists realize livelihoods through largely collaborative and playful acrobatic improvisation. Currently a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology, Nicolas's work now attends to Dukha adjustments to nature, conservation regulations within the Tengis-Shishged National Park, and vice versa, as well as to avenues toward collaborative conflict resolution. And today, Nick will be presenting an abridged version of a larger manuscript. So the purpose of this piece, as Nick writes, is manifold. First, Nick aims to help fill the seeming void insofar as a name for the whole Upper Yenisei Basin, Darkhad Depression region, and in so doing emphasize the value and facilitate the practice of treating the region as a distinct object of analysis. So Nick proposes the name Tannu Uriankhai Girdle. His second and most important aim is to trace the constitution and contestation of internal and external borders, as well as of borderland prescriptions and proscriptions in Dukha territory since the 18th century. In doing so, his objective is to situate the Tengis-Shishged National Park, a borderland territory established by the Mongolian state in 2011, both historically as well as in relation to broader contemporary political and economic processes entangled with universalized nature conservation. In order to realize this objective, Nick exposes a centuries-long tale of perjurance of Dukha people and Ithia in relation to state territorialization in what is now northernmost Mongolia. Nick orders this tale in 4 movements: late monarchism, state socialism, post-structuralist, transition, and pedal-to-the-metal neoliberalism. This abridged paper thoroughly examines the first movement before touching upon the others in conclusion. Nick begins the tale in the 18th century because that is when the area under study was fully incorporated into the Qing Empire, and it is arguably the period that spawned the earliest instance of state-governed nature conservation in the study area. So Nick finishes with our present moment, not only as a logical endpoint for the tale, but also and more emphatically to highlight the emergent and unresolved nature of conservation-based conflicts currently playing out in the area. So thank you so much, Nick, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Carmen, and thank you everybody for being in attendance. So here we go. The mountainous boreal forests, swamplands, and alpine tundra of northernmost Mongolia are home to the Dukha, a community of approximately 200 hunter-gatherer pastoralists whose livestock currently consist primarily of reindeer, horses, dogs, and in some instances, cattle, goats, sheep, yaks, and cattle-yak hybrids. These lands constitute the northern and eastern extremities of the Darkhad Depression, Mongolia's northernmost borderland, currently abutting with the Russian republics of Tuva to the north and west and of Buryatia to the north and east. The Darkhad Depression is a swath of territory that has been at the furthest interstices of powerful polities for over 2,000 years. Until 1924, the Darkhad Depression had largely remained administratively tethered with the area of present-day Tuva throughout the numerous drawings and redrawings of borders that coincided with the expansion and retreat of conquerors. According to Sevian Weinstein, first came the Kazilgans, then the Huns, followed in turn by the Tugyo Turks, Uyghurs, Kyrgyz, Mongols, Manchus, and Russians. The long-standing, persistent territorial unity of present-day Tuva and Darkhad Depression might be due in part to the region's geography. Traveling by foot, horse, ferry, raft, and canoe in the region in 1911, English geographer Douglas Carruthers noticed that here is a mountainous country of complex formation and extreme ruggedness. This mountain wall forms in itself a very important natural boundary line. In tandem with these orographic characteristics, the region's, quote, impenetrable and hostile forest zone in the wettest area of Inner Asia account for what in Carruthers' opinion was its, quote, complete isolation. This mountain wall, together with the canyons, valleys, wetlands, lakes, streams, and rivers that course through it, composes the Upper Yenisei Basin and Shishged and Delsker Murun drainage systems that comprise much of the headwaters of the Yenisei River. With all its nooks and crannies, Carruthers' mountain wall is effectively a mountain mess, erected and primarily carved long ago by the grinding of tectonic plates and glaciers, respectively. This gnarly alpine complex perdures in a heartland of the Eurasian continent as a distinct natural fortress girdled by the Altai Range to the west, the Tannu Ola to the south, the Eastern Sayan to the north and east, and the Horidol Sartag to the southeast. Standing as an effective deterrent against enemy invasion, this girdle encloses a strategic defensive position that is difficult to breach. Following Carruthers, grasping the region's particular nexus of location and topography is paramount if we are to approach any understanding of its inhabitants. In the course of the flows and ebbs of conquering polities' influence over the area, the indigenous inhabitants were integrated to the newcomers' local and trans-regional economic, cultural, and to some extent, filial networks. The result was the emergence of a distinct yet porous cultural and economic mosaic of relatively autonomous and to some extent autarkic peoples. Arguably, this relative autonomy and partial autarky has been more pronounced among reindeer pastoralists and other hunter-gatherers who inhabit the region's remotest haunts. This brings us to the goal of this essay, which is manifold. First, I aim to help fill the seeming void insofar as a name for the whole Upper Yenisei Darkhad Depression region is concerned, and in so doing emphasize the value and facilitate the practice of treating the region as a distinct object of analysis. I propose the name Tannu Uriankhai Girdle. Whilst echoing the appellation of the Qing Empire territory, the delineation of which closely followed the gnarls of this mountain complex, the proposed name harkens to the region's geographical peculiarity as an alpine and sylvan belt that holds what it encircles together. Furthermore, the name might strike another, more obscure indexical chord insofar as, among other things, girdle means the edge of a brilliant, or a cut gem, that is embraced by the setting. If we dare the metaphor, the region might be imagined as the edge of a socio-ecological gem grasped by settings of both geopolitical and analytical orders. More than merely serving as a surface to clutch, a gem's girdle is one of the myriad facets which gives the brilliant its peculiar brilliance. My second and most important aim is to trace the constitution and contestation of internal and external borders, as well as of borderland prescriptions and proscriptions in Dukha territory since the 18th century. In doing so, my objective is to situate the Tengis-Shishged National Park, a borderland territory established by the Mongolianstate in 2011, both historically as well as in relation to broader contemporary political and economic processes entangled with universalized nature conservation. In order to realize this objective, I expose a centuries-long tale of the perdurance of Dukha people and Ethea in relation to state territorialization in what is now northernmost Mongolia. I order this tale in 4 movements: late monarchism, state socialism, post-socialist transition, and pedal to the metal neoliberalism. So briefly, this is a very macro scale of the area in question of the Tannu Uriankhai Girdle. The yellow line outlines more or less this girdle. That is, of course, an emergent concept because it does not yet exist as a concept, but I'm working with this. Now we have a bit more of a focused look on the girdle as a whole. And here we have my personal study area, a small strip of the girdle, and that is essentially the territory of the current day territory of Dukha reindeer herders. I refer to the period spanning the 18th to early 20th centuries as one of late monarchism because it was an epoch in which monarchism in the area rose to a height of consolidated territorialization of frontiers, of far-reaching metropolitanism, as well as of intra and interstate porosity colored by early capitalist dynamics, which, taken as a whole, led in part to the reconfiguration and, as was the case with Mongolia and for a time Tuva, splintering of monarchic states into what would become state socialist ones. During most of the late monarchic period, nearly the whole Tannu Uriankhai Girdle was a not quite unified outer dependency of the Qing Empire, called Tannu Uriankhai. Administratively, Tannu Uriankhai was a territory closest in nature to that of an aimek, or a province. In Alan Wheeler's words, it was, quote, a sort of aimag of Manchu-ruled Mongolia, end quote. From my understanding, the territory was rather sort of an aimag that was ruled through the administrative body of the Qing territory of Outer Mongolia. It was not quite an aimag because it was not ruled by and through its own imperially sworn-in Mongol prince. And as Schlesinger exposes, aimags were predicted upon the rule of, and were quite literally synonymous with, their own exclusive prince. Schlesinger plainly distinguishes Uriankhai territories from Mongol banner territories as distinct, broad types of administrative space. Uriankhai being a rubric under which three polities, Altai, Altanor, and Tannu, were organized and set apart from borderlands and from Mongol lands, and the latter's organizational rubric of aimag. Much like aimags, Tannu Uriankhai comprised several base units called arvon, which means 10 in Mongolian, which formed arrows, largely synonymous with clans, that reported to units of a greater scale called banners, or leagues, each ruled by a league chief appointed by the military governor in Mongolianstate, the emperor's nearest representative. The chain of command between league chiefs and the military governor in Mongolianstate was not uniform and varied over time. Such fluctuation might have been a result of regional politics and of black market economies, including bribery and extortion, combined with the relative ease with which Tannu Uriankhai nomads, especially reindeer herders, transcended the bounds of largely exogenous administrative demarcations. Exemplary of such fluctuation as pertains to arrows, following revelations in 1836 that representatives of the Prince of the Outer Mongolian San Noyon Aimek regularly dispatched to some Tannu Uriankhai bannerlands to collect tribute, or extorting tea, tobacco, and other gifts from the Uriankhai and engaging in illegal trade. The emperor allowed the arrow leaders of those banners to deliver their tribute themselves directly to their league chief, who then, presumably, would deliver it directly to the military governor. However, arrows tribute-bearing caravans were victims of frequent banditry, and local leaders were indebting themselves to cover related expenses. In 1551, the old system was reinstated. The above example additionally illustrates the primacy of tribute in both Qing territorialization of the Tannu Uriankhai Girdle and in regional power dynamics. At least by the turn of the 20th century, Tannu Uriankhai bannermen were not called upon for military service. Without forcing military service, what would otherwise have been a key component in the Qing Empire's repertoire of technologies for asserting power, imperial authority over the girdle was arguably asserted to a great extent through the governing of tribute, insofar as designing, regulating, and enforcing the forms, amounts, and mechanisms of collection and submission of tribute were concerned. As gleaned from a reading of Schlesinger, imperial authority was pragmatically maintained to some extent by conferring limited but non-negligible power to regional and local leaders for collecting tribute and governing the allotment of pastures and hunting grounds to and within arrows and banners, as well as by allotting court-manufactured material gifts to those leaders who were conferred such power. To some extent, the expressly minimal intervention of the court in local governance affairs and its relative flexibility in adjusting policies to local and regional grievances and propositions were also facets of the court's pragmatic maintenance of authority over the girdle. Weinstein claims that some Tannu Uriankhai bannermen were allowed to provide livestock as tribute. However, he does not detail any source for such a claim, and none of my other readings corroborate it. This divergence in literature might be due to livestock having become an official form of tribute towards the end of the late monarchic period and therefore beyond the purview of a most thorough account of the tribute system provided by Schlesinger. Otherwise, Weinstein's claim might in fact be based on a conflation of unofficial and thereby illegal tribute collected by intermediaries anywhere in the chain between eros, military governor, and emperor, or by officers or pioneer economic kingpins of Russia that were increasingly encroaching Tannu Uriankhai, with the official tribute sanctioned by the court. Putting this unresolved claim aside, official Tannu Uriankhai tribute likely consisted exclusively of furs, and certainly consisted primarily of furs. This was the case despite the fact that not all bannermen hunted at all or else nearly as much as others, and despite the diversity of local resources that were regularly exported via unregulated or, in later times, partially regulated trade. These resources included saltpetre used in gunpowder manufacture, horsehair rope, horsehair fishing nets, paratribute fur, dressed hide, pine nuts, antlers, rock salt, salt precipitate, copper, iron, gold, asbestos, and lime. The exclusivity of fur as Tannu Uriankhai tribute has a few possible interrelated explanations. First of all, from the outset, fur held significant value in the Qing Empire, and this value increased greatly over the course of the late monarchic period. Fur held a special place in the hearts and minds of the empire's Manchu rulers, who, identifying their homeland of Manchuria with fur of the utmost quality, wore fur in court, at first at a time where fur garments were still generally perceived as barbaric throughout Chinese high society. Furthermore, both before and after their conquest of China, furs and fur garments were signature gifts of Manchu rulers to court officials and their family, as well as to foreign emissaries in acts of diplomacy. As a means for asserting their authority over non-Manchu subjects, and in so doing emblematically flex their rule over China, Qing emperors at various times from the 17th century onwards legally prescribed dress codes wherein differently arranged fur garments were mandated to be worn throughout the entire empire by different sorts of officials from the now visually distinguishable highest to lowest ranks. As specific arrangements of fur from various animals in monospecific or multispecific composite garments according to rank became mandated, a fashion of fitting fur garments with silk trimmings and vice versa emerged and eventually raged throughout the empire, including those regions where the climate would hardly beckon the habitual sporting of inherently warm furs. In this fashion wildfire, there grew a booming fur industry that seeped across the increasingly porous bounds of the tribute system, regulated trade, and the black market, wherein distributors, vendors, and consumers were becoming increasingly savvy and specific as pertains to the technical details of an expanding multilingual corpus of identified sorts of furs borne by different species and sourced from different places by different sorts of actors. An influx of alien hunters and merchants into and nearby Tannu Uriankhai and other fur-bearing lands arose. This was spurred and made possible by the conjunction of the boom of the fur industry and of other frontier industries with the increasing movement and porosity between peoples throughout the empire, brought about largely by the confluence of general economic prosperity and localized hardship that demanded and afforded policed roads and official permissions for traveling those roads. This influx of mostly black market hunters and merchants and the pressure this added on the ecosystems of fur-bearing lands compounded the pressure already placed on them by overly ambitious and realistically unsustainable tribute quotas. On their end, Russian encroachments were adding additional pressures. By all accounts, from the mid-17th century onwards, into and beyond the 18th century, the populations of fur-bearing animals began to fall dramatically, first in China, then Manchuria, Mongolia, and eventually in Uriankhai territories, with Tannu Uriankhai outlasting the others as the last remaining bastion of fur-bearing animals, although it too is being severely depleted. An unreported potential factor of the dramatic falls in game populations is the advent of the rifle, before which long-range shooting was performed with the use of locally crafted bows, crossbows, and arrows. Following its arrival via Mongols at the end of the 17th century at the earliest, rifles became increasingly integral to hunting practices in the girdle. However, even by the early 20th century, flintlock rifles, let alone cartridge rifles, were by no means universal in the Eastern Highlands, with some households having several rifles and others none. Nonetheless, rifles must have greatly facilitated hunting, thereby affording greater fur harvests. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, arguably all Tannu Uriankhai households were required by law to provide pelts as imperial tribute, even though not all households harvested pelts themselves. Moreover, paralegal taxation systems drew additional fur and all sorts of pastoral livestock goods from households. On top of that, Russian merchants came in and bartered on credit, extorting locals through horrible interest rates. In addition, there were drastic losses in livestock due to epizootic diseases among typically Mongolian livestock and among reindeer. To make ends meet, already depleted households, many of which did not themselves harvest furs, therefore had to yield even more fur than they otherwise would have. A homogeneous tribute analogous with the idealized homogeneity of Tannu Uriankhai depended on the endogenous economic integration of differently specialized livelihoods and, to some extent, culturally diverse communities embedded in networks reaching throughout and beyond the girdle. Alas, amidst alien encroachment, it relied on this diversity and integration so much that it provided the Qing court with pelts until the end of the empire, by which point the populations of many fur-bearing animals had been seriously depleted despite attempts by the imperial court to conserve these populations. This brings us to the second interrelated set of reasons why fur was the sole form of Tannu Uriankhai tribute. The Manchu rulers perceived a shared bond between their homeland of Manchuria and Tannu Uriankhai, insofar as both regions were identified with fur as a primary exportable resource, and the indigenous inhabitants of each region were associated with fur-yielding livelihoods. As Schlesinger puts it, in the Qing Empire, quote, the productivity of the frontiers was essential to their very identity, as homelands were constructed in part as a catalog of resources. Tannu Uriankhai, which arguably constituted the empire's utmost frontier, was therefore managed to a great extent by establishing the territory as an economic and sociocultural field predicated on the harvesting of a diverse catalog of furs, and furthermore by legislating the territory in ways which ensured a maximum yield of its furs and ensured that a maximum share of the exports of this yield be funneled through the empire's official channels. This was, of course, messier and less ensured in practice than it was in conceptual design. The influx of alien merchants, hunters, and antler collectors into Tannu Uriankhai and nearby lands was concern for the imperial court, not merely because of the pressures this placed on local populations of fur-bearing animals. There was also concern because the court perceived the increased intermingling of Tannu Uriankhai indigenous subjects with Mongol and Chinese subjects as liable to bringing about not only an undesirable complexity for managing what they legislated as distinct peoples associated with discrete homelands, but also as a danger to inhabitants of the Tannu Uriankhai, insofar as, supposedly, aliens would surely disrupt the former's way of life by introducing new economic activities that would inevitably further expose them to corruption and accrued debt, as they would be engaging in practices beyond their expertise with actors far more disposed to effectively capitalize on such engagements. The court's concern was therefore to some extent one of paternalistic care for people perceived as a homogeneous, vulnerable people. Added to this concern was the need to maintain and defend the empire's border with Russia. In Schlesinger's words, quote, the closer one moved to Russia, the greater the need to maintain order. There was no room for ambiguity. The imperial court therefore instantiated a purity project, whereby aliens were forbidden from entering Tannu Uriankhai unless on officially sanctioned business, and Tannu Uriankhai furs, both supplied in tribute and exchanged in regulated trade, were to be exclusively sourced by Tannu Uriankhai bannermen in their official tribute-related duties. The order legislated by the court was, of course, largely demanded by frequent transgressions of that very order. As a black market for furs flourished, the perceived authenticity of Tannu Uriankhai furs, of the Tannu Uriankhai hunters who sourced them, and of the territory that spawned them became an increasingly central feature of the officially sanctioned tribute system and regulated trade on one hand, and of the clandestine market on the other. Sanctioned and clandestine conduits were of course entangled in the same porous industry, and each was modeled largely after the other insofar as the authenticity of furs, hunters, and homeland was concerned. The aspiration, and to some extent the practical outcome of the Purity Project, was to manage human activities, and in so doing conserve both the populations of fur-bearing animals and the local livelihoods that yielded this resource. Effectively, Tannu Uriankhai became a special protected area characterized by the drawing of internal borders, as well as the prescription and proscription of people and practices in relation to those borders, much in the same manner as were imperial hunting grounds, holy mountains, and official guarded borderland territories, arguably the territorial rubrics associated with the highest form of protection in the empire. The external border with Russia in the Qing Empire's northwestern frontiers and the internal borders in the former's vicinity were complex and, despite the court's efforts, ambiguous demarcations. In broad strokes, the demarcations were simple. Nearest to the border were the official borderlands, patrolled by local servicemen based in watchposts, or karons. Next in line, towards the interior, were the various Uriankhai territories, and then, in turn, Outer Mongolian frontier imags. Movement between these three types of jurisdictions was forbidden or otherwise highly regulated. A curious and important phenomenon related to the Russo-Qing border has been remarked on by Wheeler, Schlesinger, and Hoyer. The watchposts in the vicinity of Tannu Uriankhai were positioned at varying degrees south of the actual border established with Russia in the Hyakhta Treaty. Furthermore, much, if not most, of Tannu Uriankhai territory was in fact situated north of the Karon line. These northern swaths of Tannu Uriankhai territory were effectively frontier buffer zones between official borderlands and southern Uriankhai lands, themselves buffers between borderlands and Outer Mongolia. This curious configuration might be due in part to the border posts being associated with discreetly outlined borderlands inhabited and pastured by filial groups of guardsmen, there being pastures more suitable for typical Mongolian livestock south of the geographic threshold with Russia. Moreover, the more southerly positions of the borderlands allowed for their greater accessibility in comparison with the rugged and that much more remote Tannu Uriankhai lands beyond the watchposts. Thomas Ewing suggests that control was still not believed to be secure enough to place pickets in the rugged and unknown country to the north. Together with the unavoidable porosity of internal Qing borders, the unique position of many Tannu Uriankhai lands beyond not only Qing border posts, but also, as noted by Wheeler, Russian watchposts along the Sayan Range, was amenable to a great deal of Tannu Uriankhai autonomy and partial autarky. However, it was also amenable to a great deal of legal transgressions and alien encroachment. Through external and border transgressions, and incrementally legal adjustments to permit and control the previously transgressive border behavior, merchants from all over, as well as Russian gold miners, sects of old believers, other peasant pioneers, and Cossacks officially dispatched to control Siberian frontiers, drew Russia, Outer Mongolia, and Qing metropolitanism ever closer with Tannu Uriankhai towards the turn of the 20th century. Towards the end of the 19th century, the economic integration of the Qing and Russian empires, spurred largely in their interstitial frontiers, grew to such an extent that following treaties such as the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881, the Qing court granted rights to Russian merchants in Outer Mongolian lands, including those near Tannu Uriankhai. Officially, at least until 1902, when Chinese merchants were granted official permission to enter Tannu Uriankhai in an effort to counter Russian takeover, Tannu Uriankhai remained as a last bastion of purity in the Qing territorialization project. Nonetheless, prior to 1902, the turn of the 20th century brought with it increased alien encroachment into Tannu Uriankhai, notably from the Russian side. Ewing suggests that although there were at times both sporadic and concerted efforts to rob and violently dispel Russian pioneers on the part of Tannu Uriankhai bannermen in the later part of the 19th century, The general attitude held by native authorities towards the advancing colonization was somewhat unclear, but it does not seem that on balance they were rather indifferent to the Russian, presence, not the least because of the bribes they themselves received from colonists. As the Qing military and imperial attention were heavily engaged in the European threat on the southern coast, the imperial court increasingly failed to maintain its authority over Tannu Uriankhai, despite explicit mandates from the 1850s onwards be implemented by the military governor who, without sufficient funds or troops, could hope to do very little. Furthermore, as the Qing Empire was waning, some military governors and other high-ranking officials may have begun realigning their interests with those of powerful Russians. As is possible to glean from Carruthers' account, a feeling of political transition was palpable in early 20th century Tannu Uriankhai. Circa 1911, Tannu Uriankhai was dislocated from the Qing Empire, which was itself transitioning to the state of China proper. Local authorities had mixed opinions as to which polity they should align with, Russia or the emerging Mongolian state. In December 1911, Mongolia declared its independence, and the 8th Jabtsam Damba Khotokta was appointed the Holy Emperor of an autonomous theocracy, which would encompass all Mongolian peoples, including Tuvans. Thomas Ewing argues that with the declaration of independence, Mongolian and Tannu Uriankhai lands were in disarray. Amidst this chaos, the Amban Noyan, which is a type of league chief that is chief of many leagues, assembled the officials of the Toja and Salchak banners, as well as of his own Oyanar banner, and proposed that a plan according to which these and all other Tannu Uriankhai banners should look to Russia rather than to Mongolia or China for patronage. Despite the officials of the Toja and Salchak banners conveying their desire to align with Mongolia, and without conferring with the officials of other Tannu Uriankhai banners, the Amban Noyan sent a petition to the Russian frontier superintendent at Usinsk, stating that he had been chosen as leader of an independent Tannu Uriankhai state, asking for protection from Russia and calling for the swift dispatch of Russian troops into the country because of fears that China was contemplating a move to restore its rule over Uriankhai by force. However, the Russians favored a policy of gradual cautious absorption of Tannu Uriankhai and therefore did not heed the Amban Noyan's call, therefore stifling his attempted coup that, if successful, would have brought all Tannu Uriankhai under his control. Similar petitions from Tannu Uriankhai banners were sporadically submitted to Russia from 1913 onwards, and as of April 1914, Tannu Uriankhai was formally accepted as a protectorate of Russia. Now, Wheeler paints a slightly different picture. Cossack troops were sent in 1912 to occupy Tuva and suppress any commitment to Mongolia. Then in October 1914, the Russians cashed in on the Kyakhta Treaty of 1727 and declared the Upper Yenisei Basin, including northwest Khuskul, to be a protectorate of the Tsar. In 1915, another Kyakhta Treaty was made, which left both Tuva and Mongolia as somewhat autonomous territories, but under Manchu Chinese suzerainty. Then, with the onset of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 and up until 1921, the area was alternately occupied by Chinese, White Russians, and Red Russians. Though the Soviet Union was eventually unwilling to entirely grant the Mongols' request to keep Tuva within its borders, they did allow Mongolia to keep a fraction of the territory. According to Fritters, a strip of territory sparsely inhabited and small in size, about 16,000 square kilometers, called Darkhad, west of Khuskul, was given to Outer Mongolia. With this small strip of territory being parceled off from Tuva, the Tannu Uriankhai Girdle was effectively dislocated into Russian and Mongolian sections. The Mongolian section was home to the forebears of many contemporary Dukhas. At this point in the tale, I begin focusing more specifically on the Darkhad Depression, more or less the entirety of that strip of territory that was allocated to Mongolia. Now the Dukha following an agreement of between the Mongolian People's Republic, the People's Republic of, and was based soon categorized them as ethnically Tuvan and decided that they should therefore dwell in Tuva rather than the lands in Mongolia where many of them had been living for at least a few hundred years. The Mongolian state conducted up to 5 militarized campaigns aimed at expulsing Dukhas in the time span of circa 1927-1956. During this time, on the other side of the international border, Dukhas were being hounded by the Soviet army to force collectivization and military service. Despite these military expropriation and appropriation campaigns, many Dukhas steadfastly kept returning to their pastures in Mongolia, and now, in some instances, together with family members whose pastures and hunting grounds were previously in present-day Tuva. Its expropriation efforts proving futile, the Mongolian government began registering Dukhas as Mongolian citizens in 1955. As citizens, Dukhas could access state socialist services such as medical care, schooling, and veterinary assistance, but were brought to heel by the authority of the state. For instance, many Dukhas were forced to herd collectivized, typically Mongolian livestock in steppe lands, and reindeer herds too were eventually collectivized in 1959. In a footnote, Wheeler keenly remarks that Dukha herds were collectivized the very same year that Mongolian ethnographer S. Badamkhatang conducted his fieldwork among Dukhas. We might surmise that with his remark, Wheeler may have been implicitly pointing towards what Judith Hangartner argues was the use of ethnography as a technology by means of which the Mongolian state categorized and governed peoples according to identified ethnicities and associated ideal types of economic activities, a practice that may have been a Soviet-influenced mutation of sorts of Qing-era purity policy tenets. Hangartner notes that Badamkhatang was not only an instrument of the state, but also a political actor in many ways instrumental to the design of the emerging Mongolian People's Republic. Another way in which the state asserted its authority over Dukhas was by legislatively prescribing hunting seasons, beyond which any trade and subsistence-oriented hunting was legally defined as poaching. Considering how, according to a personal correspondence with the Dukha elder in the summer of 2018, throughout the state socialist period, some Dukhas successfully transgressed international borders as they occasionally traveled clandestinely to Tova and Buryatia to hunt and visit relatives, friends, and in some instances, occult specialists. It is likely that at least some Dukhas continued hunting without reprimand, despite the state's hunting regulations. As Morten Axel Pedersen notes, unauthorized hunting was not unknown during socialism. This likely happened by virtue of secrecy and elusiveness, and, as I have been told by a young Dukha hunter, because of unspoken or otherwise informal agreements with military border guards that go on nowadays. However, based on evidence that as a result of these regulations, Dukhas were forced to rely more heavily on their reindeer for sustenance, we might presume that the hunting proscriptions were effective to some non-negligible degree. We might further presume that the proscriptions were so effectively enforced that they must have been enforced by the military, and that, as will become clear in the next paragraph, the soldiers enacting such enforcement might very well have been drafted from faraway lands scattered throughout the country, which would make them more amenable to enforce these regulations, perhaps. Moreover, we might suppose that the establishment of strictly bounded hunting seasons, though quite different from the Qing approach to Tannu Uriankhai, was to some extent a mutation of sorts of Qing-era prescriptions of official hunting seasons and wide-ranging hunting proscriptions throughout what had been Outer Mongolia. In sharp contrast with Qing policies formerly in place, young Dukha men were forcibly enlisted for 3 years of compulsory military service in regions scattered throughout the country, where they usually received vocational training of some kind. Following their military service and vocational training, few were permitted to return home and resume their taiga-based livelihoods, which consisted of husbanding relatively small herds of horses and reindeer. The state had what it perceived as better uses for these trained workers elsewhere, usually in Som, which were formerly the area.Centres. Besides, the government did not value reindeer as livestock. If anything, herding reindeer was perceived by the state as a practice indicative of backwardness that needed to be rectified by integration into the people's state socialist modernization project. In the mid-20th century, many Dukhas were forcibly uprooted from the taiga by machinations of the state, although it was not that uncommon for Dukhas to escape mandatory government service and return to the taiga. Still, others left willingly. This was likely due in part to the economic hardships Dukhas were enduring, especially in the late 1950s and early 60s, maintaining their taiga-based livelihoods in drastically transformed and unfavorable circumstances. It was a priority for the government to forcibly sedentarize those Dukhas who did not herd steppe-based livestock. In 1956, a state fishery was established on the banks of Tsakhanor Lake in what was then Rechensum, employing at first primarily Darkhad people from the steppe, and in 1961, immobile lodgings were constructed for Dukhas enlisted to work at the fishery. Until 1972, at which point the Tsakhanor Fishing and Hunting State Farm was established in Rechensum, all Dukhas, mostly elders and children, who remained in the taiga, the only place suitable for reindeer, were enlisted into either the Alten Pals Nektel, which was a cooperative in Rechensum, or the Jargasant Amdrs Nektel in Olan Ol Som, both cooperatives established in 1956. With the establishment of a state farm that provided the state with furs, much of which was exported to the Soviet Union, Dukhas were once again given the legal permission to hunt on a limited but regular basis. The hunting brigade of the state farm might be perceived as reminiscent of the Qing era tribute system, with clan membership and otherwise filial relations still playing a significant role in the local organization of hunting access and practices. Of course, a key difference was that, unlike most bannermen, all brigadiers were provided with rifles, ammunition, and salaries in return for the 250 to 300 sable pelts per year they provided the state with. In 1985, as part of an effort by the state to administratively unify the Dukha, certain swaths of the Rechensum and Ozang Som territories were parceled off and consolidated as the newly created Tsakhanor Som. Those Dukhas who had until then been dwelling within the confines of Ozang Som were relocated along with their reindeer, and presumably dogs and horses, to land south of the Shishged River, in which the taiga-dwelling Dukhas of Rechensum Som had been inhabiting, in addition to lands stretching north of the Shishged up to the borders with Tuva and Buryatia. Consequently, those Dukhas formerly of Rechensum limited their territory to those lands north of the Shishged. As I learned in 2014 in personal correspondence with Jorg Endres and corroborated in correspondences with multiple Dukhas, one household refused to be relocated and succeeded in maintaining tenure over their territory in what is now Ozang Som until circa 2010, when at that point the lone remaining householder relocated himself and his livestock to West Taiga. Wheeler remarks that the Dukhas formerly of Ozang currently dwell south of the Shishged in the informal de facto territory of West Taiga as a discrete territorial group of the same name, and those formerly of Rechensum currently dwell north of the Shishged in the informal de facto territory of East Taiga as a discrete territorial group of the same name. Of course, there was and continues to be intermarriage across East and West Taigas and beyond the Dukha ethnic group more broadly. According to a personal correspondence with a Dukha elder in the autumn of 2018, the Dukhas formerly of Ozang were forcibly relocated to her territorial group's lands south of the Shishged, but the government was not responsible for her group's territorial limitation to what is now East Taiga. The Proto-East Taiga Dukhas themselves decided to make adjustments to their territory in order to accommodate the incoming families. In 1985, there were 3 families within the Proto-East Taiga group, not long before which there were only 2. Quite approximately, 10 or so families recently relocated from Ozang joined the nascent East Taiga group. Some additional families eventually relocated themselves to East Taiga from West Taiga, and from 1990 onwards, many Dukhas relocated themselves to East Taiga and West Taiga from Tsakhanor Som Center, leading up to and following the collapse of the fishery there that had accompanied the chaotic transition from state socialism to capitalism and eventually full-blown neoliberalism. Financial aid from and mercantile integration with the Soviet Union, which had accounted for a significant portion of the Mongolian People's Republic's economy and greatly facilitated the financing of the state's infrastructure was reduced in 1989 and stopped altogether in 1991. In financial and consequently social and political turmoil, the Mongolian People's Republic's state socialist system virtually collapsed in the transition to a capitalist state, or the dawn of what is known in Mongolia as the Age of the Market. This transition spanned the years immediately preceding and following the admission of Mongolia into the World Bank Group in 1991 and the passing of a new constitution in 1992. Following the lead of post-Soviet Russia and of investors, namely neoliberal entities such as the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Asian Development Bank, Mongolia embarked on a crash course of privatization. This was implemented through the means of a legislated shock therapy that had devastating effects throughout the country, namely the closure of state enterprises as a collapse in living standards, declining public services, and rising levels of unemployment. Some of the most extreme destabilization occurred in Mongolia's remotest areas, none the least in northern Khuvsgol-Emek, namely in the Darkhad Depression, and perhaps most drastically in the province's northernmost sum of Sakhanor, where, as a practical matter, the newly formed state could in many ways provide the least support. State farms and collectives were disbanded in the mid-90s, and their proprietary capital, livestock, buildings, equipment, etc., were sketchily privatized. Having previously depended largely on the broader infrastructure of the state, the Soms in the Darkhad Depression had little capital to distribute. Local and regional power dynamics for decades to come were put in motion in the manners in which individuals capitalized off this privatization of these relatively measly resources or not, which in principle was to be egalitarian, but in practice proved much messier. Pedersen exposes how the very lack of the state's activity in the region, or the non-omnipotent omnipresence of the state felt by locals, and how power in political, economic, and occult domains was seized and asserted by effectively harnessing the chaos of transition, which, according to Pedersen, was characterized by individual, not quite shamanic states, and drawing on Tausig's notion of magic of the state on the overarching, not quite shamanic state. We might suppose that, despite the overall lack of state control over the Darkhad Depression, and arguably especially over Dokhaz in the 1990s, it is quite possible that the Mongolian government dedicated considerable efforts to guarding the country's northernmost border with a now less inherently friendly Russia, to which Mongolia was no longer a subordinate satellite state. In addition to military patrols, one way in which the state asserted its power over the borderlands was to manage them under administrative rubrics of a nature conservation-oriented tenor. At the eastern edges of Dokha territory, the Mongolian government established the Tengis-Shishged National Park in 1992 and the Horitol Sartag strictly protected area in 1997, with support from the US government and foreign NGOs. These were precursors to the establishment of the Ozan Taiga strictly protected area in 2003 and the Tengis-Shishged National Park in 2011, which agglomerated the remainder of Dokha territory under the folds of state-governed nature conservation. These protected areas and the prescriptions and proscriptions of activities within the borders drawn for those areas find their legal grounding largely in the 1994 Law on Special Protected Areas, which includes rules and penalties that apply nationwide. The funding was more secure for nature conservation endeavors than it was for other governmental activities, such as education, in the region, in part because protected areas drew their budgets from the Ministry of Environmental and Green Development in Ulaanbaatar, rather than from local or regional government entities. Aside from what we might presume has remained a state practice of harnessing nature conservation infrastructure as a technology of power for the control over the state's remotest borderland, the reasoning for establishing and funding state-run nature conservation territories included responding to the dramatic drops in the populations of many species, as reported by local hunters and conservation wardens alike. These dramatic drops were due in part to illegal hunting having skyrocketed in the 1990s, perhaps facilitated to some extent by wardens allegedly accepting, or rather demanding, bribes. According to my conversations in the field, Dokhaz and other locals, as well as aliens, turned ever more to hunting for pelts, antlers, and precious minerals to sell to merchants for China-bound markets at undervalued prices. Even some Dukha hunters, let alone aliens, were unfamiliar with or otherwise did not heed Dukha hunting traditions aimed in part at sustaining game populations. As a result, animal populations that likely never fully recovered from the Qing era fur industry boom dropped even more. However, an important factor to bear in mind is that even as late as 2017, according to the US National Park Service, northernmost Mongolia has been characterized by, quote, some of the largest deficits in data, where there is insufficient information to assess extinction risk with any confidence. With its strict regulation of hunting, the state was circumscribing Dukhas as pastoralists above anything else. At first, the government retained ownership of Dukha reindeer. In 1992, the state began leasing reindeer to taiga-dwelling Dukhas, whose ranks were joined by more and more Dukhas, namely those who had been working at the now defunct fishery at Zaganor. In 1995, the state completely privatized the reindeer by essentially giving each family the same reindeer herd that they were leasing from the government. Hunting regained prominence among many Dukhas, some of whom were hunting and otherwise dwelling in the taiga for the first time. Engaging with their territory in place-based livelihood activities, newcomers were faced with the rude reintroduction to long-forsaken spiritual fields, and those Dukhas who were veterans of the taiga were faced with the far-reaching effects of neophytes' relations, with labile and finicky place master spirits, land spirits, water spirits, demons or ghosts, ancestor spirits, and other shamanic spirits. With the rise in misfortunes, not exclusively entangled with post-socialist transition, but largely associated with it, shamanism increased in importance. Many Dukhas became shamans or otherwise tried to, sometimes rather unwillingly, or nearly became shamans. In other words, throughout the Darkhad Depression, there was an emergence of bushig, or what Pedersen termed not quite shamans. Locally, the authenticity of shamans was commonly contested. As is still the case among Dukhas, a refrain throughout the Darkhad Depression was that genuine shamans were a thing of the past. Hangartner argues that local contestation of shamans dates back to at least the 19th century and is actually a key aspect of the ongoing constitution of local shamans' legitimacy or lack thereof. The apparent increase in shamans and the contestation of shamans' authenticity is perceived locally as entangled with the mutual integration of shamanism and the market economy. As evidenced in Hangartner's account, Mongolia, and in particular Huvskul Aimag, and shamanism became destinations and attractions for foreign and domestic tourists at the turn of the millennium. In time, and largely on account of forces outside the taiga, Dukhas and especially some Dukha shamans became integrated to the emerging cultural and ecotourism industry, of which they are now arguably one of the focal features. This industry is an important field in which plays out the bolstering of a new post-socialist Mongolian national identity, key features of which include nomadic pastoralism, shamanism, and environmentalism. 30 tab. All right. As is the case with other countries, nature conservation is a priority for Mongolia, in part because it generates bureaucratic capital that lends its value in regional and national politics, in foreign policy, and in the securing of investment or other funds through any number of neoliberal mechanisms. Already in the 1990s, Mongolians in the capital seemed to perceive environmentalism as a potential means of linking local interests with powerful and wealthy Western conservation organizations. In the 21st century, more than ever, Mongolian nature conservation bears an entanglement of interests and actors that issue from and bleed across an increasingly diverse array of domains within and beyond Dukha territory and Mongolia. Tengis-Shishged National Park is certified and funded through a complex and labile configuration of public, private, and charitable organization actors in domains traversing regional, national, multilateral, international, and transnational scales. This is exemplary of how contemporary nature conservation endeavors, especially large-scale ones, are embedded in what Elizabeth Garland has termed the conservationist mode of production. This mode of production is predicated on the appropriation of natural capital and on the amplification of its value through various mediations that ultimately transforms it into capital of a more convertible and globally ramifying kind. As I have argued elsewhere, the Dukhas and their homeland are agglomerated into a wilderness primitive pastoralist commodity. In its local application of universalized tenets of conservation in accordance with International Union for the Conservation of Nature Category 2 guidelines, Tengis-Shishged National Park regulatory framework effectively restricts Dukha movement, inhabitation, and livestock raising to around 1/3 of their territory, the other 2/3 being most optimal for reindeer, harvesting wild resources, and where most Dukha sacred sites are located. Regulations also impose a formal ban on fishing and on harvesting certain medicinal plants, and a near outright ban on hunting predicated on the requirement for financially or otherwise logistically inaccessible hunting permits. Taken together, these restrictions result in a de facto exclusion of park inhabitants, heavily compromising Dukha's land use rights and their abilities to legally, but also practically, make a living in their homeland. Aside from employing a few Dukhas, which is itself a contentious can of worms, Tengis-Shishged National Park has provided Dukhas with at least one beneficial outcome. The Tengis-Shishged National Park's stepping out of the illegal mining boom of 2008-2011 and of the murders and prostitution that accompanied it is the only benefit that was recognized by every Dukha interlocutor with whom I broached the subject. Granted, my interlocutors were rarely the ones who brought up that benefit, or the very notion of Tengis-Shishged National Park related benefits for locals. Locals have plenty ideas as to the benefits that actors beyond the taiga derive or outright harvest from TSNP, Tengis-Shishged National Park, and from Dukha's role in upholding Tengis-Shishged National Park's allure. Although some Dukhas allegedly participate in the abated, albeit ongoing, black market mining industry, the interests of Dukhas and Tengis-Shishged National Park generally overlap insofar as prohibiting certain actors from mining the area is concerned. According to a personal correspondence I entertained with a Dukha elder in 2018, circa 2005, a big company came to East Taiga and started digging at mountains with machines. The residents protested and the company withdrew. However, according to the same interlocutor, who worked as a Tengis-Shishged National Park ranger for several years, even since the establishment of Tengis-Shishged National Park, mining companies are not forbidden by law from operating in the park should they receive the necessary permits. Many Dukha interlocutors have stressed that, in their opinion, Tengis-Shishged National Park is effectively a means for preparing a silver platter of mineral and other resource extraction for foreign corporations. A platter from which some Mongolian elites or otherwise a rare few might feast on scraps. This view was echoed by a Mongolian anthropologist in a personal correspondence in 2018. There might be two exceptions to the lack of the state demonstrating flexibility towards Dukhas in the management of their territory. First, since circa 2013, the state provides reindeer herding householders with monthly stipends. Some Dukhas view these arguably compensatory stipends as obstacles to their land rights reclamations. Others fear these admittedly useful stipends are making people lazy. Many Dukhas claim that the stipends are collected by many people who do not herd or even own reindeer, and fear that the government will not be able to dish out the funds for too long. Nonetheless, as late as September 2018, the state was indeed still footing the bill. Second, following Dukha grievances, in 2016, the state issued a permit system whereby Dukhas may dwell and pasture their livestock in the Tengis-Shishged Basin, a Tengis-Shishged National Park zone that cross-cuts lands to both the north and south of the Shishged River, in which such activities had until then been entirely proscribed for approximately 5 years. Of course, the catch is the permit. To quote Rane Willislev, never underestimate a stamp. Each permit is valid for only 1 month, and obtaining one permit necessarily implies obtaining 3 permissions. Permissions must be obtained in advance from Tengis-Shishged National Park, military, and local government officials up to 175 kilometers away from Dukha dwellings. Furthermore, in order to obtain these permits, a person has to register with the government where they will be going, for what purpose, with whom, and in charge of how many and what sort of livestock. For any number of reasons, let alone the secrecy necessary for the effective and safe practice of hunting or other clandestine alleged activities, most of my Dukha collaborators do not wish to detail their movements for the state. Moreover, many interlocutors told me that, even with these permits, dogs and rifles are proscribed from the Tengis-Shishged National Park because of their alleged use in hunting. Nonetheless, some do bite the bullet and register for permits, which most interlocutors of mine admit are usually not refused upon application. In autumn 2018, I heard rumors that the following year, East Taiga folk might summer in a higher altitude valley bounded within the Tengis-Shishged National Park, located a few kilometers from the border with Russia. Whilst flying in the face of the state, this would afford the lower altitude valley within the bounds of the Orchne bush zone in the park. They had been summering in for about a decade at that point, with time to fallow. According to personal correspondences I entertained with Dukha interlocutors in the autumns of 2019 and 2020, it seems that all East Taiga households indeed summered up near the border both those years, and tourists visited, all this without the necessary permits. This blatant transgression of state territoriality illustrates both steadfast ability Dukhas have to maintain the de facto boundlessness of their homeland, and the complicity of the state in the unfolding of the tourism industry on its own, according to the free market. Moreover, it illustrates the complexity of the region, especially in its areas nearest to the international border, and the trickiness with which the state, Dukhas, and myriad aliens, myself included, are faced in their engagements with a territory that, more than ever before, is simultaneously regulated and opened up to outsiders hailing from lands farther away than ever before for more purposes than ever. Now on to the conclusion. Just a little reminder. Internal and external borders throughout Dukha territory and surrounding areas have been constituted and contested in various ways by actors of all sorts since the 18th century. The establishment, regulation, and adjustment of territorial prescriptions and proscriptions on the part of the state on the one hand, and the adherence to or transgression of legislated frameworks for particularized lines of authorized engagement with territory on the part of differently sorted actors on the other, have been integral to the constitution and contestation of all sorts of boundaries in the long-time borderland region of the Tannu Uriankhai Girdle. Together, the contested constitution and constitutive contestation of boundaries in and surrounding the fraction of the girdle that is currently circumscribed as Mongolian state property compose the setting in which play out contests over territory within and surrounding a national park that is at surface level quite benign, clearly delineated, and simple to both conceptualize and implement. Naturally, matters on the ground are much messier and more indeterminate. These contests over territory blur the lines between different sorts of actors and between different domains within and beyond Tengis-Shishged National Park, and are to some extent constitutive of the material makeup and discursive staging not only of Tengis-Shishged National Park, but also of the very actors and domains engaged in these contests. We might go so far as to say that many of the dynamics at play here have been essential to the playing out of territoriality in the region for nearly 3 centuries. Safeguarding and surveying borders, especially those of an international order, controlling the movements and specific activities of people within and surrounding territories demarcated by such borders, and idealizing people as constituents of typified peoples associated with specific homelands and related resources, ethea, and economic activities have each been integral and intertwined strings pulled by states and plucked at by various actors anywhere in an ambiguous spectrum ranging from marching in step with states to stepping on or even dancing over the latter's toes. Territorialization of Tannu Uriankhai specific to the Qing Purity Project was not only an arrow in a quiver of the state's disposal for safeguarding, surveying, and maintaining control over wild and crucial borderlands between the Qing and Russian empires, and between those borderlands and the frontiers of Outer Mongolia, itself a frontier of the Qing Empire. It was also an instance of state-governed nature conservation that predates the establishment of Yellowstone National Park, commonly thought of as the first of its kind, not only in North America, but also throughout the whole world. similar to the Yellowstone model, which has contributed greatly to the constitution of explicit state-governed nature conservation endeavors ever since. The Qing Purity Project was implemented to a great extent through the idealization of and control over indigenous or otherwise local people identified with specific territories and, at least insofar as discourse is concerned, through the preservation or else prohibition of relatedly idealized livelihoods and lifeways. Characteristic of the Qing Purity Project, the preservation of fur-bearing animal populations and the habitats on which they depended was synonymous with the preservation of essentialized peoples, ethea, and livelihoods, itself a means of preserving the state of affairs whereby authentic hunters in equally authentic and quite literally synonymous homelands fulfilled their tribute duties. The fulfillment of these duties not only emblematically and practically constituted the state's authority over inhabitants of the Tannu Uriankhai Girdle, but also provided the state with a regular, outstandingly diverse, and prolific supply of furs, themselves prime commodities of nearly universal value, if only throughout the Qing and Russian empires, as well as much of Europe and North America. The Mongolian People's Republic territorialized its portion of the Tannu Uriankhai Girdle in a similar fashion. However, with some key differences. The Mongolian People's Republic state-building method of drawing precise nationalities as boundaries around and between peoples along lines of ethnicity and ethos, similar to such practices integral to Soviet management of Siberia, served the state insofar as it was a privileged means of controlling different uses of different sorts of territories and integrating the economic productivity of remote regions with the state economy and with different ethnicities, vocations, and nationalities in the ongoing composition of the state's overarching people's project. The use value of the Qing Empire's method of drawing loosely defined yet strictly regulated boundaries around and between peoples along the lines of ethnos and ethos was virtually identical, with one significant exception. Whereas the State Socialist People's Project demanded comprehensive integration and interjurisdictional movement of all people throughout the country, the Imperialist Purity Project was tantamount to the comprehensive segregation and intra-jurisdictional stasis of specific peoples in specific areas. As Schlesinger astutely remarks, the state has proven to be remarkably successful in preserving these special protected areas spaces as pure in the late monarchic period and natural in ours. Nowadays, many of the restricted areas of the Qing, including the Uriankhai borderlands near Lake Hovsgol, have been reconfigured as national parks. Modern nature is genealogically linked to imperial purity. I believe a key divergence differentiates the earliest and latest links in this genealogical chain. Whereas the late monarchic Qing Purity Project was partially realized to a great extent through general proscriptions of alien access to Tannu Uriankhai, Mongolia's neoliberal ethno-ecotourism project is being partially realized to a great extent through the prescription and promotion of alien access to TSNP. A significant convergence of these genealogically related links is the effective construction of territory on the one hand as a catalog of resources and of identity and related authenticity on the other as a catalog of services. Together, these catalogs constitute the state-authorized business portfolio for the region. This portfolio has transitioned from cataloging furs and hunters for business largely within the state's confines to cataloging mineral deposits, species of fauna and flora, the rarer and more endangered the species, the greater its value, and shamanist reindeer herders, the more populous their reindeer herds, the greater their value, for state-authorized business originating and occurring within and beyond the state. Among myriad other dependent factors, such state-authorized business, as well as unauthorized clandestine business that occurs in its counterparts' shadows and interstices, constitute a setting in which diverse conflicts and challenges play out. Amidst such volatility, many Dukha interlocutors have emphasized the importance of unity and leadership within their ranks, and have lamented the current fragmentation among Dukhas and lack, indeed need, of a Dark chief boss. I have often been told that clan leadership no longer bears the same clout it once did, nor do the traditional elder-junior structural dynamics. Despite the best efforts of the Tsatan Community and Visitors Center, a Dukha community-run NGO dedicated to structuring local tourism in ethical fashion, different households or settlement groups largely fend for themselves in their engagements with complex and labile business networks from which they derive drastically varying profits. Perhaps there is a lack of leadership, and perhaps this owes itself in part to the disappearance of the late monarchic fur tribute system's authoritative and organizational structure, of the state socialist era state farm, collective and brigade system structure, and of the gifts officially authorized leaders received from the state and with which they bolstered their power. Nonetheless, various recent news articles portray a lone East Taiga resident as its chief. This so-called chief happens to be a shaman and is arguably one of the most crucial indigenous actors and stakeholders in the local tourism industry. In my estimation, he is indeed the person whose authority is nearest to what I imagine would be that of a chief. For instance, according to my observations and conversations, this man's household and settlement group's migratory movements seem to at least occasionally bear considerable influence on those of others. My PhD dissertation project aims to strengthen Dukha's positioning in the power contests over the territorialization and valuation of their livelihoods and homeland. By attending to Dukha adjustments to Tengis-Shishged National Park's regulatory framework and vice versa, as well as to avenues toward collaborative conflict resolution, I strive to help nurture and learn from the steadfast, albeit dynamic, perdurance of Dukha people's ethea, livelihoods, livestock, and habitat, and of Dukha's relations with the myriad other material and spiritual beings with whom they cohabit throughout their boundless homeland, beyond the delimitations of militarized border watch posts and patrols, conservationism posts and patrols, and indeed the states these borders and borderland practices bolster, much as they and their forebears persistently have since long before the period which I set as the beginning for the plot of the present tale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for presenting and such rich detail and beautiful images as well. This was really fantastic. So we're going to open up the Zoom floor for questions if anyone would like to ask.
I see you, John.
Yes, that was a wonderful talk, and I love the combination of the establishment of a historical framework for the current dynamics. I thought that was wonderfully pieced together. I was especially interested in the discussion of the conservancy along the border, which of course evokes in the African setting, many of the great protected areas are on the border and in some ways constitute the border. And that's an interesting set of dynamics about how borders are negotiated in the context of areas that are less habitated and which are protected. What I wanted to ask about is the neoliberal mechanisms that you talked about, and you went on to talk about a number of issues, stipends being paid, which is of course the state, but I guess it keeps the so-called private sector of pastoralists going, and I'd be interested in hearing a bit more about that. And the other is the creating of ethnic units. I'm not quite sure why that would be tied up and why there would be a neoliberal interest in having that sort of demarcation. But finally, what sort of modes of extracting of value? You talked about portfolios, which assessing wildlife numbers and minerals and what are the assets of the state, but you didn't talk much about tourism, and I'm quite interested in the strategy of having protected areas that are sort of intrinsically valuable as opposed to somehow extracting or attracting benefits coming from abroad through tourism or whatever. If a if an international a body like the IUCN pays a grant, which they do all over the world, and that's an important source of income, and yet it doesn't seem to be built into any sort of business model. It simply says if something is failing on its own terms, let's provide an infusion of cash. So those are a few of my, I found them intriguing, would love to hear a little bit more about those dimensions.
Those are great questions. Well, let's start with the third one. So, and if I understand correctly, are you interested to hear both about the value of tourism, but also about the intrinsic value of a national park, and then how those two sort of relate? If I understand correctly?
I'm interested in whether there are tourist flows, which in the usual neoliberal idea would justify the protection or making it accessible, these resources to outsiders. And so I'm interested in what are the neoliberal dimensions of these policies.
Sure. Well, so in one way, the sort of the criteria of Category 2 protected areas, which of IUCN Category 2 protected areas, which Tengis-Shishged National Park is recognized as. Part of it is, that the protected area have value for recreational and/or touristic purposes. So having that, the tourism industry operating within the park helps this national park actually fulfill the necessary criteria to be recognized as a Category 2 protected area. That's one thing that I would say that the value of the tourism in that extent for the government to actually receive that money, as you say, and the support, but also the bureaucratic capital that goes along with having Category 2 protected status, because since that has happened, they also have a partnership with the Yosemite National Park. It's their sister park, so they receive funding through there. And now there's charities that raise money to get motorcycles for rangers. It bolsters their status as a park worthy of receiving more funds and things of the sort. So that's one aspect of the tourism. The other aspect of having tourism, so tourism, I believe, is the third largest and most important sector of the Mongolian economy writ large. And there are two pockets within the country where tourism is most prominent and most valuable. One being the westernmost province of the country, where there are Kazakh eagle hunters. That's a big tourist destination. The other being Hufskul province. Most people making it only to the Lake Hufskul, which is west of the region where I work. But there is one family of, well, there's been a few more now, but one family of reindeer herders there. So reindeer and reindeer herders have become one of the more focal points of attracting people, either of attracting people to Mongolia, or often once people arrive in Mongolia, they look for things to do. And then the reindeer herders become sort of that, most exciting remote area where they could go to have the most authentic experience, kind of thing. So I do think that the reindeer herders, like having an accessibility to tourism within that national park, not only allows the national park to have the status it has, but also, is an important part of the Mongolian tourism industry as a whole. And then regionally is that much more important for the tourism industry there. And I would also venture, and this isn't so much, related to the economy, but, to have tourists visit the Dukhas, it's harder for the Dukhas to sometimes go and hunt and do things that are illegal when there are a bunch of tourists visiting them, and they also have another form of income. So it's a way of sort of trying to, help compensate reindeer herders for losing a bit of the legal leeway to hunt and to live anywhere they want, because now they can join the free market and become tourist hosts, and they can make carvings and sell them to tourists, etc. So that's what I'd say to that. Now, these sort of ethnic bounds, the limitations around ethnicities and sort of how that's involved in neoliberal processes. You know, part of that I think is, and I intended it to be, is mostly just a sort of way of managing territories and peoples. But I do think there are some associations that can be made with more economic places, because, or more economic facets, because you know, these Dukha people who themselves, you know, I got there in 2014 and first thought that they must really, you know, feel different than other Mongolians. They do, but I haven't met a single Dukha who hasn't told me, you know, I'm Dukha, I'm Mongol. Some even say I'm Darkhad. You know, their identification goes beyond just their subculture, you know, and so they really see themselves as Mongolian. However, if you look in, you know, Lonely Planet or any tourism thing, it always sort of emphasizes the uniqueness of the reindeer herders within Mongolia. And often, you know, if it does talk a bit about their history, it will say they are from Russia, they are from Siberia, from Tuva. So much that even anthropologists will write that. And it's not, granted, there's not much written about the Dukhas in anthropology, but I, until recently, you know, was under the impression that basically all Dukhas were refugees in Mongolia, but really a lot of them had been living in Mongolia for at least a few hundred years. So this emphasis on the uniqueness and difference of these Dukha reindeer herders from other Mongolians, although it might just be an error, you know, people don't have enough information, whether it's an error or not, consciously or not, it has use value in the way that it highlights these people as the most, well, I believe the most special, but one of the more special features of Mongolia that's unique and different, that would funnel everyone to one place rather than going anywhere in the country because they're all the same, they're all Mongolian herders. Here is a more special thing, it's more focused, and it has a bit more cachet, a bit more financial value, and actually some of the more expensive tour trips that people can organize. You can go on a budget to the reindeer herders, as long as you're in the country, that costs money, but you can go on a budget and you can spend a lot of money. And some of the more expensive trips are to the reindeer herders. And now for the stipends, briefly, I'd have to check my notes to tell you exactly how much money they get every month. But basically, every reindeer herder, well, there are cards. These cards are supposed to be given to the reindeer herders, but I've been told that many other people have these cards. You go to the bank, and every month, with this card, you can get a stipend for every adult householder and every child householder. The adult stipend, if I'm not mistaken, let's say it's around $70 a month, Canadian dollars, which is decent. And for children, it's half that. So that's a decent amount of money. It's helpful. People there tell me it's not enough, and I can attest to the fact that it's not enough to live off, but it definitely helps. One thing about that, and it's made, you know, the government says it's to help support the reindeer, and it's very possible. Help support the reindeer herders, to help make sure that they don't have to slaughter their own reindeer as much, which is a more common occurrence, especially since hunting is illegal. So they can buy meat elsewhere, which means that they can help keep raising more reindeer, which is their goal, because it's part of raising the number of animals, of livestock. And then of course, it's just more of a draw for tourists, I would imagine. That's basically how those stipends work. And of course, I mean, you know, this is a whole other issue, but sometimes more money doesn't mean more money in the bank. It means, you know, more money spent on vices and things like that when you're in the village. But that's essentially how those stipends work. And some people don't want them for the various reasons I said, but they still find them useful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well.
Does anybody have any further questions?
Carolyn. Caroline, I saw you had your hand up. But you are on mute.
Hi, Nick. That was a wonderful presentation. It was very rich, and I also appreciated the historical context you gave. I guess, I mean, it's a fascinating project in general, but I was curious if you could talk a little bit more about some of the impacts of the extractive industry in the region you were studying. I know I've been interested in Mongolia for a while because of Rio Tinto, the mine. I think it's in the southern Gobi Desert, but they're using a lot of these neoliberal approaches to conservation, such as offsets, and involved in some of the park creation. So I'm not sure if any extractive industries would be posing some sort of tension in your case study near the Tengis Park Reserve, or for the people you were living with, the Dukha, I think. Sorry, my pronunciation, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Is there any sort of collusion between the extractive industry and the conservation initiatives in that region, or any tension therein?
That's an excellent question, and you know, I'm severely underinformed about issues happening elsewhere in Mongolia. You know, perhaps, but the Gobi Desert is by far the most mined region in Mongolia. The region where I work in northernmost Mongolia is believed to be either as good in terms of how much mineral deposits there are in the Gobi, if not better. And I mean, I've never been to the Gobi, but I would venture to guess that yes. You know, in 2014, I would walk around and find pieces of jade. Like, you know, it's and you can feel it. Those mountains, those rocks. There's something there. You know, and so the only time I heard of an actual like legal mining operation that was happening was in East Taiga a few years ago, and you know, I admittedly I've had very little information about this company. It was basically through one elder told me about it, and then a few other people we spoke. But I should look into that more. But what happened there was basically the companies came and the community protested, you know, until the company left. That's what I got as a reason. Now, there might be other things that happened that contributed to the company leaving, but of which I don't know. And I found nothing online or anything I can do like that. There's relatively little written about that area online, especially in English, and my Mongolian reading is pretty bad. That's it. So one major challenge and you know roadblock to the mining is you know not that it's a national park, because you know as you mentioned, there's some mining that goes on and you know with offsets and things of the sort in the south, and also as many interlocutors told me, you know, that mining companies would be allowed to come mining, and they personally think that you know the state is preparing for eventually selling off the rights to mine this land, which I imagine would eventually you know, include things such as offsets and things to be able to make it a viable option, not only economically, but also in terms of the respecting the criteria of IUCN status. But the major challenge is that it's you know, it's quite a rugged, remote area where it's hard to even you know drive to the nearest village, let alone into the taiga. Now, of course, machines can do a lot, and you can get a lot of places with them, but it's you know the U.S. National Park Service in a document in 2017, I believe, called it one of the most remote areas in the world. That might be a bit of an exaggeration, but it's still not far off. So it would be really hard to have industrial mining there. Now, there has been artisanal mining, otherwise known as ninja mining, where you have you know individuals who clandestinely mine for gold themselves with very minimal infrastructure. It is possible, actually, come to think of it, that some of those mines might have been remnants of old Russian mines, because in the area, at least I know in present-day Tuva, in the 19th century, mining, actually gold miners, was some of the first Russian pioneers to make it out there. They started small-scale gold mines and even hired local indigenous people as laborers and things of the sort. So it's possible that there was a, sort of a remnants of, 19th century industrial mining that pales in comparison to the, industry of the current era, but that they basically went and sort of reignited the mining industry, but themselves quite low technology kind of way, which involved a lot of people from elsewhere in the country coming to the region, a large influx of cash, vodka, and bullets. And so, there's a lot of horror stories that happened circa 2008 to 2010 in West Taiga, with there being prostitution rings, murders, and let alone spiritual upheaval. And that was a really booming industry. And then the national park, I imagine with the military as well, clamped down on that. And from all evidence nowadays, that mining is no longer happening like it with such infrastructure. It still happens. I've seen all sorts of pretty special looking gems being handled in the area. When I even licked to test if it was salt, but it was definitely a crystal of some sort. And there's some in the shadows trades that eventually, from what I understand, those gems make their way to Chinese markets. But I don't see any possibility of like a partnership with conservation in that regard. But in a funny way, clamping down on aliens coming in and doing artisanal mining helps make it so that there's more minerals left for the locals to illegally mine, and make money that way. And if they have more money, who knows? Maybe the government isn't working that hard to clamp down on small scale mining, because if you sell gems, you have more money, and then you have more money, you can pay more taxes, buy more stuff. So I don't know, but it's a good question.
Thanks. Anyone else have any further questions?
L'audience est bouche bée. Sweet. Well, I mean, I imagine there's not more questions. From the looks of it.
All right. Well, in that case, thank you so much, Nick, for everything. This was absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, well, thanks to you. Thanks everyone. It was my pleasure, and I hope it. I hope it was good. I hope you enjoyed it.
And thank you for everyone who joined.
Yeah. So yeah, and we will be reaching out in the times to come with more information about the winter lineup, the speaker series. A great thanks to Carmen for all her work for this speaker series. It was a privilege and honor to work alongside you, Carmen, and to kind of cap off the term with this talk.
Right back at you. What a great way to end. All right. Have a great one, everyone.
Okay. I'm here all week. Okay.